Good morning. I'm Eric Hunt. Welcome to the MTOM podcast. I'm your guest. Paul Yeager is the host, but I'm introducing the podcast again.
I think it works, Eric, when we do it this way.
I enjoy it. I introduce myself on my own podcast, so I'm used to it.
You're the only one I do this with because you do have that history of hosting things and your broadcast. Tell people before we go any further, where can we see you?
Well, you can find me lots of places. If you're in Nebraska, you can definitely find me on Market Journal on Saturday mornings. That's on TV. That's on PBS at 7 o'clock. If you are outside of the state or far western Iowa, you can watch the Market Journal videos on YouTube. Just Google Market Journal YouTube. It'll show up. Usually the weather segments are available by Friday morning. The whole show is worth watching, though, as is the Market to Market show. In Nebraska, we get Market to Market and then Market Journal back to back. I don't know how it works. There states Market to Market comes on Friday evenings in Iowa, right?
That's when we originate, yeah. There's a couple other states that air us on Friday, too.
But technically, we have a digital antenna in our attics. We actually could pick up the Iowa PBS station. So if we wanted to on Friday night, we could watch it.
Or you can always watch it online. That's an option, too, through our YouTube channel. What's the big topic everybody wants to ask you about? It's always about the weather, but anything specific?
Well, lots of stuff. It's been pretty warm across portions of this, country here the last week or so. We've had a record-setting ridge of high pressure across the north central portion of the country. The Minneapolis sounding had a 600 decameter reading earlier in the week, which I know to anybody normal doesn't mean anything, but for a meteorologist, 600 decameters is very, very impressive. That's something you probably would see more over the Southwest. So we saw very, very impressive levels of upper level ridging in the atmosphere, the north central portion of the country. We've been very warm, the dry, and now we're starting to get smoke coming in. You have wildfire smoke in Ontario, and that's starting to push south and southwest, actually. So as I'm speaking, there's some real air quality issues. Wisconsin, Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, pushing into Illinois. I think we'll see some air quality issues coming into Iowa, Nebraska, but I think we'll miss the worst of it.
I have a question. Give me an English version of what the decameter so high in Minnesota means.
So on the sounding, the pressure levels, so we have, kind of set pressure levels like 850 millibars, 700 millibars. So 500 millibars would typically be somewhere around 20,000 feet above. So it's not quite cruising altitude. But the higher that height is for 500 millibars or for any other pressure level, the warmer the atmosphere is overall. So 600 decameters means the atmosphere overall is just incredibly warm. Now, in the wintertime, it could probably drop into the low 500 range, certainly 520, 530 range in this portion of the world. Occasionally, you'll see it really dip down closer to 500 if we have just an immense cold snap. But 600 decameters is very impressive. I think the only reason we haven't seen even higher temperatures than what we have is that what we call atmospheric mixing hasn't been that substantial. So we haven't been bringing down extremely warm air adiabatically and getting temperatures into the 100s across a large section. We've been in the upper 80s to 90s over a large section of this portion of the country. And we have seen some 100s across portions of the northern Nebraska Panhandle and in the Dakotas, eastern Montana. But it's not like 1936 where you probably had a comparable ridge in place where you saw temperatures that were well over 100 degrees for a large portion of this continent.
We have a comparison coming up here in the slides. We'll get to that in a minute. Is this setting up then, this 20,000, is that a heat dome?
You could call it a heat dome. A heat dome is basically a strong upper level ridge that has a lot of heat in. So in the summertime, a ridge is always going to bring warmer than average temperatures. But in the summer, we tend to call them heat domes just because they are associated with heat waves. We are definitely seeing that across portions of the northern plains and upper Midwest. Thankfully, though, I'd say a lot of the Corn Belt has just been warm this week, but we've been dropping off a bit more at night than I think we were anticipating. And, the high temperatures have been generally somewhat under what was forecast. So we've had a lot of upper 80s, low 90s. Not ideal, but certainly not necessarily the worst either.
Well, it sounds like we're getting to have near record global temperatures.
We are. Right now, we are running just a bit shy of 2023. So 2023 was not the warmest year on record overall. That was 2024. But 2023 was the warmest year on record for a lot of the latter portion of the year. So that's in large part because we were going into a relatively strong El Nino in late 2023 and early 24. So we're Earth is warming on a relatively quick pace, but El Nino tends to kind of add a little bit more heat onto it. So it kind of gives us a temporary extra fever. We're starting to see that. So earlier in the year, we were generally running below 2025. We now are generally running above the 2025 mark, which is that line in orange. And that kind of darker gray line toward the top, that's 2023. My guess is we will probably be following that and probably at times exceeding it here in the last half of the year. And just for comparison, in 1982, we were going into also a very strong El Nino. That probably was the strongest El Nino in the last half of the 20th century. It's the strongest in my lifetime and probably a lot of people's lifetimes. But the baseline, 1982, was about 1.5 degrees Celsius cooler than we were so far in 2026. So the extra heat that's going to be added to the atmosphere is going to be meaning our temperatures are just going to flat out be much, much warmer than they were in 1982 and early 1983.
I should mention, if you're listening to this episode, this one's one of those visual ones. So we just talked, when Eric talked about the orange and the gray, that's on the chart. Then you have the near record global temperatures. You kind of talked a little bit about this. This is comparing June to the second half of the 20th century. And then you've got a different one that's on the right.
Yeah, so the one on the left is basically just kind of showing the upper air, the 500 millibar anomalies for the month of June. So that's where we're going to try to pick out where the ridges and troughs were. So if you were sitting under a ridge more for a whole month, you're probably warmer than average. So, for example, we had more troughing in place over the northern plains, which is why one of the reasons why we did have a bit more storminess across portions of the central U.S. in the month of June. And we also saw temperatures that were generally relatively mild. We did not have a lot of heat in the north central U.S. for most of the month of June, which is, I would say, is the first time that's been the case in about 7 years. We did see some significant heat in the eastern U.S. late in June and then early July. And we also saw some of that across ports of the Midwest as well. But really, I think the big story, though, across the pond, we had extremely high temperatures across a lot of Western and Northern Europe in late June. And we saw a massive ridge in place over basically, it's kind of centered over France. And I'm just basically trying to show that we had a lot of upper level ridging in place over Western Europe, which, that creates a lot of sinking air, a lot of warm air being brought back from, brought adiabatically back down the surface. So we had temperatures that were over 110 in parts of France. Paris is 104. Frankfurt, Germany, at one point I looked on the aviation weather site in the afternoon in late June was like 103, 104. They don't have much air conditioning over there. Hopefully they can start, getting some added because they are starting to see a lot more intense heat in the summers. And the figure on the right basically just kind of shows the 500 millibar height anomalies in the last 10 summers, so 2016 to 2025, compared to the second half of the 20th century. And you see a lot of browns and oranges on there. Basically means the heights were just higher than they were, which is an indication that we've warmed up. I mean, that's just, I don't know the way to put it. We're getting warmer. The atmosphere is getting warmer. But you'll notice there are a couple of darker blobs right off the West Coast and then right over Western Europe. So we've seen a lot more heat in the Western U.S. in the summer than we have in the Eastern U.S. We've also seen a lot more heat in Western Europe, and in large part because the atmosphere, at least in the last 10 years, has been preferentially putting ridges over the Western U.S., more troughing, say, like near Iceland, but more strong ridging over Western Europe. So consequently, we've seen a lot more heat waves in Western Europe. And I think my hunch is that we're going to see that trend kind of continue. The Western U.S. is warming up much more quickly than the eastern half of the U.S. in the summer. That is a trend I expect to continue. I also anticipate the heat waves in a lot of Europe probably continuing.
Yeah, if we would have had World Cup in Europe, we really would have needed the hydration breaks, not just like we had in the United States.
Absolutely. Well, I don't know why they just, to me, if you're running around on the soccer field for 90 minutes being a hydration break, makes a lot of sense regardless if it's, 70 or versus 100. But
right.
Yeah, it would have been a problem if they had the World Cup in Europe this year. Thankfully, here in the U.S., there were some really, really hot matches around the 4th of July in the East. But by and large, we've kind of been lucky that, some of the matches on the West Coast were generally, we've been okay with heat. And then, month of June, we generally were kind of getting by okay in places like Kansas City and Philadelphia, but 4th of July, Philadelphia, I think it was 100, 102.
Yeah, miserable.
At kick. And then I think the heat index is like 107 in Miami for that England Norway game, which they're not real used to that kind of heat and humidity in Norway. So.
And people are getting to experience our storms. You mentioned here this spring. June, the 4th of July weekend for me was ridiculous, and I know I wasn't alone.
Yeah, so you guys had just a tremendous amount of rain there for a couple of days, right? Central Iowa.
Yeah.
So some hail. The hail reports in 2026 are actually below average, but the wind reports are certainly up there. So we've seen a lot of wind damage across portions of the country this year. We've also, especially in some places, had a lot of tornadoes. Illinois has had a record number of tornadoes this year, and I believe they actually still have the most tornadoes of any state in the country. So it's kind of continuing trend of seeing more tornadoes in places like Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and western Tennessee, eastern Arkansas, and somewhat fewer in, say, the Plains. But, again, this is another summer we have some pockets that have just had a lot of wind and hail damage. I know here in Nebraska, June 19th was bad news for some of the central portions of the state, a lot of wind and hail damage. South Dakota, I think, might have set their all-time wind gust record in late June. They had 131 miles an hour in Hightower. I might be mispronouncing the name, but there was a town near Pierre, South Dakota, that recorded 131 mile-per-hour winds. That, it actually literally leveled the wind turbines. Like, it literally took them down.
Treated them like toothpicks. Yeah, I saw some of those pictures. Your blue line here is us right now in 26. What's that? Which dotted line is way above all the other norms there on that graphic?
That is 2011. So 2011 is kind of the gold standard for just completely massive outbreaks of severe weather across a large portion of this country. Not all at the same time, but Southeast that year, we had April 27th, 2011 stands out as this horrific outbreak in Alabama, Tennessee, other parts of the Mid-South, Southeast region. I think that was a Joplin year in May. We also just had a lot of just wind and hail damage across the country in general that year.
Yeah.
Very, very active weather pattern. We haven't necessarily replicated that since. I hope we don't replicate that upper pattern anytime soon.
Thursdays means the drought monitor, the data is cut off on Thursday, the one that came out on the morning we are recording this. So if you're watching this on Tuesday, we're talking Thursday. A little behind the curtain there. What's the drought monitor picture other than I see a lot more red?
A lot more red. However, there is less red on this map than there was 2 months ago, which is good. So, my home state of Nebraska, we actually have seen a decent reduction in the levels of extreme and exceptional drought in the last 6 weeks. That's good. So, there's still a lot of drought, though, in the West. There's also a lot of severe, extreme, and in some cases exceptional drought across portions of the Southeast Mid-Atlantic region. It's been incredibly dry. North Carolina, Virginia, South Carolina. Florida's still dealing a lot of drought issues. We have seen some decent drought improvement across, say, like portions of Tennessee, Mississippi. Generally speaking, right now, the Midwest, Corn Belts, by and large, free and clear drought, but there are areas I am concerned about. I'll get that here in a little bit. Portions of western Iowa and eastern Nebraska have been pretty dry here the last 30, 45 days. It's been pretty dry across the portion of the upper Midwest, northern Minnesota in particular. We've seen some pretty rapid degradation. And then again, we still see a lot of drought across portions of the West. I think an active monsoon has been kicking in here in recent days, will help alleviate some of those conditions in places like Arizona, Utah, and Colorado, and New Mexico. But then again, it's also one of those things where it's been so incredibly dry there that any convective heavy rainfall rates are going to cause flash flooding. That's going to be a concern.
Yeah, that's the one that you mentioned. We were talking before we started recording about California, and on certain cities, yeah, it doesn't rain much, and when it does, it's a problem, and that's what you're talking about there. So let's move on let's get a little bit into the crop side of things. The last couple of times we've talked, Eric, it's been about wheat conditions in Nebraska. Well, that winter wheat crop is mostly gone, but the conditions have not improved.
No, and my understanding is the USDA just lowered their estimate even more for production in this country. So one of the lowest that we've had in decades. And if you look at this plot, this is actually from GeoGlam. They had some really nice plots for global crops like wheat, soybean, corn, and rice. And if you look at the where they have a lot of that orange basically shows very poor conditions across almost the entire Great Plains region. And that's in large part because we had massive drought conditions over the western, most of the plains this past winter, early spring. Some places have seen some improvement of late, but it was too late for this year's crop. The northern plains, the wheat conditions considered better. They actually consider the wheat in the eastern portion of Washington to be exceptional. That's not offsetting what we lost earlier in the year in the central and southern plains. You'll notice globally, though, there's a lot of areas where we do have wheat where conditions generally are not that bad. France is kind of a concern. But other parts of Europe generally are okay. Turkey is considered exceptional for that area. And where we do have some wheat in South America, things aren't too bad. So in other words, a lot of other areas where we do have global production, the wheat has been mostly okay, which I'm guessing is one of the reasons we haven't necessarily seen the wheat prices shoot up to places like they did in 2010, 2011. I think it'd be really, really high then.
And then for corn, there's not the I'm sitting here going back and forth between the two. I'm looking for the watch and the pour. I don't see a lot of pour. I do see watch conditions and just a smaller part in Africa. What else do I see here on the maize conditions?
Yeah, I mean, when I see this, I see now granted, this is a little dated, so I think they update this about every 3 or 4 weeks. So I would anticipate seeing a little bit more yellow across portions of the Corn Belt. But by and large, there's a lot of green on there, which basically means conditions have been favorable. I see a lot of favorable conditions across South America, other parts of Europe, China. So there's not really a lot of areas around the globe where we have a lot of corn production where things are really, really, really struggling. The Caribbean, again, the El Nino tends to be more suppressive of precipitation on that area. So I think we're going to see some issues there. But you also notice that they do show some of these figures kind of show you what's maybe the cause of it. Not all cases where we are seeing the yellows isn't necessarily a drought condition. In some cases, this is socioeconomic or conflict, rather just political, geopolitical issues going on there that are causing issues, which unfortunately a lot of parts of the world we still see that.
And we do have corn and soybean in drought. You said the one was a little outdated. This one looks like it's a little more updated. Again, if you're listening, watch this section.
Yeah, so I mean, on one on the left shows where you have drought areas. So like anything you see where a red line through means that you're in drought. And on corn on the left and soybean on the right. And you'll notice that we do have a large portion of this country in drought. It's just for anybody that wants high prices on corn, soybean. Unfortunately, or depending on your perspective, it's not in where we have the heart of corn. Now, again, there are places in Nebraska and Iowa I'm concerned about. But by and large, where we see that green, that dark green, that is the major crop area. By and large, that is mostly free and clear of drought on both corn and soybean. And I kind of anticipate that mostly continuing here for the next month or so. So I think that window for getting the big weather scare, it's not gone, but I don't think it's a huge window.
Well, last week on the show, Ted Seifert said if we can just peck away with a little bit of crop stress and change that yield, that would have an impact on the market. So if I'm looking at what I see here in Nebraska and South Dakota and trim a little bit in some of those spots of Iowa, it could happen. But that's just like with Ted and you, Eric, could is a word that allows you a lot of flexibility.
Could allows me a lot of flexibility, which meteorologist is great.
All right, what about soybean? Kind of the same situation, right? The heart of the big green areas are not in a lot of stress.
Exactly, right. And I mean, there's places that I'm sure could use a good rain, but as I'll get to in a little bit, I think the rain's going to come back, here the next week to 10 days. So I think a lot of areas have had some decent amounts of soil moisture to work with. So I think we were able to get through this stretch of relatively warm temperatures and no precipitation. Okay, there are years we really couldn't afford this dry spell, but this year I think a lot of us had enough reserve to kind of get through this. So we're not out of the woods. There's definitely places, if it doesn't rain in the next 10 days, you're definitely going to see some yield declines. But at this point, I think it's in terms of having major drought being a cause of significant yield loss. I'm not really seeing that in play. Usually, if we are going to have massive issues from drought, usually we are seeing that in play over a large portion of the Midwest by this point in July. That's not really in place at this point.
We had a lot of moisture early, a lot of humidity, and a lot of ripe conditions for last year's problem of tar spots.
Yeah, so we actually have seen tar spot creep in pretty early this year across portions. Certainly Nebraska, we've had a lot of reports of it, which we didn't see tar spot enter the state until late 2020. So it came in from presumably from Iowa and northern Missouri. And then we've kind of seen it gradually spread west. We've seen it really make strong westward progress here this year. Haven't seen as many reports of it elsewhere, but again, just because you don't see your county listed in orange doesn't mean you don't have. Those areas are basically just means where we confirmed it. Now, what I will say, though, is especially in Nebraska, we did have a more anomalous easterly flow in the lower part of the atmosphere during the month of June. So it's very possible we just saw very favorable conditions for it. And really, more cloud cover, which we did see across all this region month of June, just enough wetness and kind of mild temperatures. Tar spot likes mild temperatures. It doesn't necessarily really like the heat. So the higher temperatures that we're getting right now may be actually beneficial for the corn in the sense of keeping the tar spot. Now, heat is more favorable for southern rust. I've not seen a lot of reports of that this year, but I'm suspicious it's come up in the last couple of weeks because we have at times seen very just kind of persistent southerly flow coming up from Texas, Louisiana. So that's where it tends to come from. I warn folks, so in that crop protection network, northern Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, Illinois, we're really good about reporting it up here or there, less so down in that portion of the country. So don't rely necessarily on just seeing those reports down there. It may well already be in this area. So my recommendation is to always go out and look at your fields. At least that's a plant pathologist's recommendation. I'm just passing on their recommendations to anybody listening to us at farms.
And now you want to get into insurance a little bit?
Yeah, so I ran across this figure on LinkedIn the other day. So I used to work for a company called Atmospheric Environmental Research. At the time, they were owned by Verisk Analytics. They provide a lot of services to insurance sector. And they had a team, I think they were what they're called. They were called Extreme Event Solutions by the time I left. So they do a lot of work for the crop insurance sector, or at least one this team does. So they have this really nice map that shows where the enhanced coverage option indemnities may kick in at 95%. So, I mean, that basically just means a 5% yield reduction at the county level, not a significant reduction, but enough that it would trigger a payment. They're basically showing that there are parts of Illinois and Iowa and the Dakotas that for various reasons may kick in. Now, I think in parts of Illinois, that's not necessarily a drought story. That's probably more of planting might have been a little bit problematic. There's been a lot of excessive wetness at times, which I know in parts of the Corn Belt, it's actually more detrimental for it to be too wet than too dry. That's not really our problem out here very often, but in parts of Iowa and Illinois and Indiana and Minnesota, too wet actually is probably more of a problem than being a little on the dry side.
Let's look at, speaking of dry side, the pasture conditions. There is no surprise here in what areas seem to have the stress. Yeah,
so again, we showed the drought monitor earlier. The western half of the country, generally speaking, we have a lot of stress. So veg dry combines satellite reflectance of vegetation and a long-term precipitation index. So the nice thing about that, though, is the reflectance will override precipitation indices that are kind of skewed positive because of the couple of big rain events. So it really is picking up the stress pretty well across the sandhills of Nebraska, Wyoming. So a lot of our rangelands this country, while I think they have improved a little bit in some places in the last month, they're still generally in pretty bad conditions. So, I mean, we just, until we really see these rangelands improve in a really meaningful way for a long period of time, it's going to be difficult to get that herd size back up because there's simply not enough forage production. And the figure on the right, that's the forest drought response index. And you'll notice that, across portions of northern Minnesota, we have some extreme stress on forests. Same thing across a lot of the southeast. So a lot of those fires that you've seen start up in Ontario, presumably some of those same conditions, that are really ripe for forest fires have been going on in Ontario. I think you see that kind of creeping into northern Minnesota. And I think there have been some fires up there. So basically, I think the fire danger up in that area is going to be relatively high the remainder of the summer unless we start really getting some more significant precipitation up there.
And the outlook for drought, again, holds similar stories in similar areas, it looks like.
Yeah, so the outlook that was, again, this is a little day at this point. They generally release that late in the month. But they are expecting some improvement across portions of the West. So I think we are expecting to already are seeing a relatively active monsoon places like Arizona and New Mexico. So I think we are going to see some drought improvement there, which is great because, they really had a bad winter late portion of the year. But they are expecting drought to persist, though, across most of the plains. They are expecting more development in Texas. Now, again, they've just been getting tons of rain in Texas here last 2 days. So that may push that can down the road, kick that can down the road there. But I do think there's going to be potential for it to dry out and heat up down there. So I think some places we'll see that drought risk. And again, they are expecting drought to probably be relatively persistent across a lot of the mid-Atlantic region. There may be some opportunities for improvements across portions of the Southeast, portions of the Northeast. But by and large, I think we're still going to be dealing with some drought issues in portions of the eastern U.S. I do think we may see continued improvement across portions of Nebraska, but if you're D2, D3 areas, that it's going to be very, very difficult for those to be completely free and clear of drought by the time we get into early October.
And there's been some precipitation in Nebraska, just not enough. And we mentioned already central Iowa where there's a spot, but man, Missouri, Kansas, Kentucky have been way above what they normally get this time of year.
Yes, and some of those places were insanely dry. Like Kentucky was extremely dry earlier this year. So like at one point there was the Ohio River Valley, or Ohio River was like the line between who had been getting moisture and who hadn't. Kentucky's done a lot better here in the last 30 to 60 days. But you'll notice, though, that there are pockets where it's been very, very wet. So there's parts of Kansas and Missouri where we've had a lot of precipitation. By and large, I think a lot of eastern Iowa and Illinois have had adequate moisture. But there are pockets like northern Indiana. There's a pocket where we've been pretty dry. But I really want to point out that area of western Iowa and into northeastern Nebraska that they've really generally been missing out here in the last month of 6 weeks. And from a soil moisture perspective, I am concerned that they are fairly short. And if we don't get decent moisture there in the next, I would say the moisture that is projected right now for the next, say, 7 to 10 days, later in the month, that has to come to fruition, or else I think we're going to be looking at potential for more of a 2020 type event in that part of Iowa, where we did actually see some relatively big drop-offs in yield.
And that also is reflected a little bit in the soil moisture here. Of course, Eric, you and I could spend all these times. Soil moisture you've kind of talked about, so I'm going to skip a little bit there. You see in Nebraska the water stress level and where there's adequate moisture. But you've flirted discussing, I shouldn't say flirted, it's more of a tease, that there's a pattern change on the horizon.
It's teasing to a certain degree, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, it is.
Yeah, so I do think so. Right now, we've had the ridge has been very prominent over, basically centered over Aberdeen, South Dakota, toward Minneapolis here for a lot of this current week. What we're likely going to see as we move through time is that ridge is going to shift toward the south and southwest, going back over toward the Four Corners region. So that's going to open up more ridge riding storm opportunities for us here across the high plains into a lot of the Corn Belt. So the expectation is we get in next week, we should start seeing more routine chances of moisture. And right now, like the European ensemble is actually showing above average, being favored from Wyoming into certainly western Iowa. So I think there's going to be opportunities in places like northeastern Nebraska, where we have more rain-fed corn, and western Iowa to actually pick up some significant precipitation. Now, again, this is the time of year where our rainfall is almost entirely from thunderstorms, which means that some places get a lot, some places don't get enough, and sometimes the rain doesn't come in ways that are particularly helpful in terms of infiltration. So it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to see like a full profile of moisture coming back into, say, a place like Carroll, Iowa. But what it does mean, though, is that we should get more precipitation. I think my thought is that a lot of places that have been relatively dry are going to have chances to get some decent moisture here the next week. And I think if they do get it, I think there's going to be a chance that their yields are still going to be pretty good in those areas. You also notice they are expecting pockets of above average in cross portions of Illinois, Missouri, Indiana, Ohio, and not necessarily showing a lot of brown, which basically means that we are expecting at least potential for average precipitation, meaning that even though we have been pretty dry of late, we should start seeing the faucet turn back on and hopefully stay on, not too on, but as long as we're getting some chances of moisture every few days, I think that's really would set us up pretty nicely through the rest of reproductive phases for corn, and I think that would set us up relatively well for pod filling for soybean.
You mentioned Carroll. Carroll, Fort Dodge, Cedar Rapids are three communities next week that are hoping, or this week as this is airing, if you could keep the rain away from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. and with no lightning within a 15-mile radius so we can play state softball and state baseball. That's really all that matters, and especially those that are on the TV crew for Thursday and Friday of this week. The heat is shifting south. It's looking like with that pattern change, I see Oklahoma and Texas, as well as Arkansas, Missouri getting their point. The outlook for the storms, again, I'm flying because I need to get to the next thing. Here, the CPC extended outlook. You see the temperature outlook there on the left, the precip on the right. Real quick, anything on either of those two graphs, or can we just keep going?
Yeah, I mean, basically showing that we're not expecting to see the heat really persist for a long period of time. In a lot of the north central portion of the country are probably going to see better chance of moisture come back into this region.
Okay. And are you missing a word? Did you skip a word on the El Nino slide? Where's the word super in front of it? Are we not in that now?
Well, we're not in a super El Nino just yet. We're headed toward it. So we are right now, there is a strong probability that we will be in a very strong El Nino by the time we get to this fall and early winter. This may be the strongest El Nino we've seen in over a century. So there are going to be some global impacts from this.
And those are?
Well, I mean, most likely we'd see major drought develop across portions of Indonesia, northern Australia. We already seeing some issues across portions of India in terms of dryness. The Caribbean likely be pretty dry, probably be relatively wet across portions of the southern U.S. We'd be probably very wet in some parts of South America. Western South America, we don't normally get a lot of precipitation. But, I think by and large, the most of global impacts from El Nino tend to be more from, say, like the Tropic of Cancer, Tropic of Capricorn. But it can have impacts to the entire globe, including us here in the mid-latitudes, Midwest of the U.S.
Yeah, what's going to be the biggest impact for El Nino or super El Nino for the grain growing areas?
Well, I mean, I think the biggest impact for us would probably be, generally speaking, if we have the stronger the El Nino, the warmer the winter is. So I think I would feel relatively confident saying this winter was likely going to be pretty mild. Now, there's parts of the northern plains that would likely be a little bit cooler than last year's because last year was the warmest on record. But by and large, you're probably looking at a relatively mild winter coming in unless we are coupled with some other things that right now we aren't necessarily expecting. Looking ahead, like in the next couple of months or so, the models I think are kind of struggling with the upper air patterns. Like, for example, the European model has been just really trying to be very bullish in the seasonal time frame of heat and dryness in the central U.S., even though from an historical perspective, usually if we're going into a pretty strong El Nino like we were at 82, 97, 2015, and 23, we generally are not really cranking up the heat for most of the Midwest and eastern U.S. It generally stays south and west. And we generally are getting somewhat adequate moisture for a lot of us. Now, some places are a little dry, some places a little wet, but there's nothing in here, at least in terms of these composites, just screams major drought pressure coming to the central U.S. Even though that is in some of the models, I can't discount it entirely. That is not the most favored solution based on historic precedent.
I did throw a lot of graphics on top of what you just said, your ECMWF, your isobars, the analog composite. You kind of talked about the winter El Nino precipitation. So I covered all those while you were talking on that section. I'm going to ask you a couple things here to wrap up, Eric, if we could.
Sure.
When we talk about grain growing states, grain growing regions, the heat this week, the heat last week, the heat that's forecast, but the cooler temperatures, how much are the traders noticing that type of thing? Does it already look like the commodities have let out some of that weather premium based on these forecast changes?
I would probably assume so. I mean, I think the warmer temperatures are probably going to be still somewhat prevalent across the Western Corn Belt. So I don't know, we're looking at like a prolonged cool snap coming in, say like here into Western Iowa. But as long as we're getting some moisture and we're not just consistently having lows in the 70s, I think we're going to see, the yields probably still have decent potential, is my guess.
And generally, so generally speaking, weather looks like it can continue, like on a couple of those slides where we talked about the main growing regions of corn and beans are setting up to have All systems go for good.
That's kind of what it looks like right now.
Anything else we need to cover today?
I think that covers it.
Oh, we got one more thing. You mentioned the smoke.
Sure.
The impact, I know last year that was the thing we've talked about a couple of times over the years here, Eric, is how that has impacted us in August. Does that shift? I know you kind of mentioned its potential in Iowa. I mean, Minnesota has the fires themselves, but I saw Chicago have a lot of that haze. Do we think that the haze is going to be a story?
It's more of my understanding right now is probably more of a 2-3 day story. If it does persist for a long period of time, then there would be potential to certainly reduce some yields. I know Mark Jeske at Corteva has done some really good research showing that early reproductive stage of corn, you can see some relatively non-trivial yield reductions if you have a lot of wildfire smoke aloft. Now, it has to be relatively persistent. I forget exactly what stage it was, but there was a stage of corn where if you had that smoke at that period of time, it did reduce those yields by, probably I was thinking about 10%. I don't quote me on those numbers specifically, but I do remember the reduction was real and was noticeable for some of their studies they've done.
Okay. Well, I always find it fascinating. That's why I keep calling. It's always changing in the middle of the growing season. Always good to have an update from you, Eric.
Yeah, I mean, the good news this week is a lot of places we've been dropping a bit more at night than I think was anticipated. So we've had lows, that have not been necessarily optimal, but they haven't been terrible. Like mid to upper 60s is a lot better than mid to upper 70s. We've seen more of that heat a little bit further toward the north, but we've seen some warmer days, but that larger diurnal range for corn is not terrible as long as you have the moisture. What you don't want is highs in the low 90s and lows in the upper 70s for 2 weeks. The 90s plus that really warm temperature means your respiration increases a lot. Just like human beings, we don't like sleeping when it's really warm. Corn, soybean, they don't like the really warm overnight temperatures either. The fact that we have been able to drop off a little bit more at night than I think was anticipated to this point at least has been useful. And I think for places that have had the moisture, I think the pollination has been pretty good because we've had cooler. We've been dropping at night. We've had a nice little breeze, but not too windy, and we've had that large diurnal range, from say mid 60s to low 90s.
I can tell you the one that has to go to football practice at 6 a.m. doesn't think it's been very cool in the early morning hours, so he would like to talk to you after we're done, Eric.
That's okay.
All right, Eric Hunt, great to see you. Follow him. You can find him on Market Journal on Saturday mornings, also the Crop Watch podcast. He's also on the Nebraska State Climate Office website and from the University of Nebraska. Great to see you, Eric. Enjoy the rest of your week.
Thanks as always, Paul.
We are produced at Iowa PBS. Our production supervisor is Sean Ingracia. His crew is Reed Denker, Kevin Rivers, Julie Knutson, Neil Kyer, and David Feingold. The executive producer of Market to Market is David Miller. I'm Paul Yeager. We'll see you next time.